Okay. Welcome to our first session for lectures, plenary lectures. It is my great pleasure to be able to introduce a man who needs no introduction. But actually, we should do this in Latin. How do you say after 7 cups of coffee, I think I'm ready? Okay, absolute. Pauculis, 7? Septem? Exhaustis. Ego paratus. Oh, dic, Abigail. Satis, pocket. Okay, good. So, Jason, obviously the president of the Paideia Institute, and a great promoter of the Latin language and all things humanistic. And we look forward to this lecture on the difference between the active method in Latin and the grammar translation method, rooted in the scientific knowledge of the 19th century. And other thing, also the fact that with no preparation, here he comes, filling in for, unfortunately, our speaker who couldn't be here this morning. So, Jason, please.
Yes.
Take it away.
Thank you, Matthew. Yes. Thank you all for coming. How many of you were at the CamWest Southern section in 2018? 0. Perfect. Because I originally wrote this talk then, and when we found out that we had a speaker pulling out last minute, I decided, hey, Gabby, around, I don't know, this morning, that this is how we would solve that problem. So exceptionally, I'll be reading off my phone, just because I had to sort of pull this together quickly and couldn't get access to a printer. So I hope you'll bear with me. All right. So the first person I ever heard speak Latin extemporaneously was this guy. Wilfrid Stroh. This was while I was studying on a year abroad in Germany in 2004. This is the world-famous Walafridus, author of the book Latein ist tot, es lebe Latein, which is actually out in English translation. Latin is dead, long live Latin. I remember standing in the classics library of the University of Munich at 23 years old, and he got up and addressed the first-year classics students in Latin, and it was the first time I'd ever heard anyone speak Latin, and I still remember his accent. So I remember he said something like, "Loc famini Latine quo melius Ciceronem intellegamus," or something like that. Right? It's this very beautiful moment. But I really wanted to be in Italy, the ancestral home of the Pedicone. My professor as an undergraduate had said, if you want to be a good classicist, you need to go learn German and learn German philology. But I was longing for Italian otium south of the Alps. And I eventually made my way there because I found out about the summer program offered by Father Reginald Foster, Reginaldus, who some of you may know of. That's where I met Professor McGowan and Bev as well, who's also in this room. And sort of in some ways, the origin story of the Paideia Institute was that summer program. This was an amazing 2-month intensive spoken Latin program in Rome. And Reginaldus had this, unlike Stroh, who was a German philologist par excellence, who also spoke Latin, Reginaldus came out of the Catholic Church. So it was a different tradition, a sort of different institutional trajectory in which Latin had never really died. And that was really where I fell in love with Latin and classics and decided, I want to become a classics professor, or so I thought. At the time, and it was the way he taught. It was this amazing mix of sort of philological rigor but also the living tradition in the church. This was a guy who had spoken Latin at lunch every day for the past 40 years with monks. And so it had a certain vivacity that really turned me on. And so I decided to apply to graduate school and do a Ph.D. in classics. And to my surprise, I was accepted by elite and discriminating graduate programs. And I ended up at Princeton. And when I got to Princeton, I was surprised and somewhat dismayed by the reception of my enthusiasm for speaking Latin. Now, I wasn't completely condemned and humiliated for this interest. I was kind of like, well, isn't that cute that they want to do that? So they paid for pizza once a week, and we had a Latin table. And they, to their credit, they did also provide me summer funding to travel to Greece, where I heard another German, a guy who, I'm not making this up, his name was Helmut Quack, speak ancient Greek for the first time. But it was clear that the spoken Latin and ancient Greek exploits were not the main focus, let's say, of graduate education in classics in elite universities. They were more interested in critical theory. It was sort of the end of critical theory at that time. There was a thing called intertextuality that was very hot. Intertextuality will inform you that like Homer can make allusions to Virgil, which was news to me. But this is what we were doing at Princeton in 2006. I remember traveling to Italy at one point to La Scuola Normale di Pisa. Does anyone know about that institution? This is like the preeminent humanities institute in Italy. And I met a man named Gian Biagio Conte, who was probably one of the most important scholars of Latin poetry of his time. And I remember telling him about the beginnings of the Paideia Institute, and I had studied with this guy, and because I was working on stuff related to what he studied. And I said, and we all, we speak Latin as a living language. He looked at me and he said, bello. And Italians have a way of saying bello when you understand immediately that what they mean is, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. But he said, bello, ma nostro lavoro è un altro, okay? Which means, yes, nice, but our job is to do something else, right? And so I was really struck by this binary attitude, utter disinterest in this practice that I found so engaging and revitalizing of the humanities. And so I began to grow interested in why this was. It ranged from sort of, isn't that cute, to slightly more occasionally, demeaning comments. Like I remember one time I was at Cornell and I heard a professor in the classics department say, spoken Latinists, yes, they're like the Civil War reenactors of the, which I presumed was not a compliment. Apologies if any of you are Civil War reenactors. And at this conference, it's not, so impossible. Anyway, this was my slide for Reginaldus. His great quote along these lines was, "Lingua Latina non est piscis mortua, or mortuus." The Latin language is not a dead fish. It's not something to be dissected dead on a table. I found this very inspiring. And there's Conte. These days, the Vatican itself is even sort of taking a stance on spoken Latin. And this is Ivano Dionigi. He's no longer president of the Pontifical Latin Academy, but he was the past president, and he issued a statement on spoken Latin, and this is what he said. I quote it in Italian because I know you can all understand because you know Latin. Il Latino è una lingua morta, fortunatamente morta. Fortunately, it's dead. Così ce ne spartiamo l'eredità. That's how we all sort of spread and enjoy the patrimony. It's patrimony. Questi tentativi di riportarla in vita a tutti I costi sono avvocati sbagliati per una giusta causa. These attempts to bring it back to life are mistaken advocates for a just cause. This is the Vatican. Okay, sort of speaking out against spoken Latin. And those of you who know what's going on in the Catholic world know also now that there's sort of concern about the Latin Mass from the Vatican. So this is a dichotomy that is omnipresent in the world of classics. So I began to ask myself, why is it like this? Why? I don't know if you've looked around, but there's 4 or 5 universities here in New York City with classics departments, and none of the faculty are at this conference, even though this is one of the largest gatherings of Latinists in New York City ever. And so that is more evidence that there is some kind of interesting dichotomy at play. So I began to, like a good classicist, delve into the causes, into the sources, and try to figure out what was going on. And so what I came up with is a sort of idea which I'd like to present to you all that essentially, because of what was going on during the Enlightenment and into the formation of the university in the 19th century, the humanities has adopted what I'll call scientistic outlook on itself, a need to justify itself in scientific terms. But I think this is reactionary because they were on the defensive, so we can't blame the 19th century Germans too much. Anyway, this is what they were up against. So I quote to you John Locke. Listen, this is Enlightenment ideas about Latin. Can there be anything more ridiculous than that a father should waste his own money and his son's time in setting him to learn the Roman language, when, at the same time, he designs him for a trade? If you ask them why they do this, they think it is as strange a question as if you should ask them why they go to church. Okay? So at this time, in the Enlightenment, there was a sort of collective effort by Western society to slough off old-fashioned, religious, superstitious approaches to education, which were basically everybody just had to sit there in a classroom reciting Amo, Ama, Samat, and that's what education was. And so this is the sort of new Enlightenment progressivism, and it was really down on classics, right? And sort of one understands why, because you know the Monty Python skit. But he's like that. There's a reason that's the prototypical image of what a Latin teacher was. Here's another wonderful quote from the Enlightenment. Herder, the great German humanist Herder, who himself in many ways loved the classics. Nationalism was on the rise at this time, and people were rediscovering their own identities, their national identities via their own languages, right? So, for instance, in Germany, it became very important to speak German and not Latin. Same thing we see this also in Italy and France. And this is a German humanist during the Enlightenment. This is what he says about Latin: learning Latin ruins thinking and writing in endless letters, speeches, periods, and verses. It gives nothing and takes much: truth, liveliness, strength. In short, everything natural. It produces the vapid pedants, puckered periodists, baleful schoolmarms, and frivolous letter writers, of which Germany is full. It is a poison to last a lifetime. Can you believe it? This is what people were saying about Latin, right? So the classicists, people like Wilamowitz, for instance, Ulrich Wilhelmovitz von Müllendorf, who some credit as being the father of modern classical studies, felt the need to fight back against this attitude and say, no, in fact, what we're doing is scientific, and it's not just a sort of religious, ideological, old-fashioned style of education. And so they began to fashion a more scientific approach to the humanities. And I like to call this the time when Wissen gets the shaft. Okay, they actually coined a new word, which is Wissenschaft. So there used to just be das Wissen, which was sort of knowing, knowledge, wisdom. Wissenschaft is the scientific, systematic study of something, right? And so they began to see themselves as Wissenschaftler, and they coined a term for the humanities and also for classics. And the term for the humanities is fantastic in its oxymoronicness. The humanities was Geisteswissenschaft, spirit science, okay, literally in German. That's how you say humanistic study. And classics became known as Altertumswissenschaft, the science of antiquity. Now, there was a famous debate at this time. Some of you perhaps have heard of Friedrich Nietzsche. Yeah. So Nietzsche published this fascinating study of Greek tragedy, applying the philosophy of Schopenhauer to ancient Greece to sort of explore the human condition via the ancient world. Nietzsche was professor of classics, you may know, at Basel. So this guy, Ulrich, over here, was not impressed with the sort of poetic, philosophical, freewheeling approach of modern philosophical theories to the ancient world. There was not a scientific enough analysis. And he published a review called Zukunftsphilologie of Nietzsche's work, which ended Nietzsche's career as a classics professor, not as a philosopher, obviously. But the critiques that you see him using are fascinating. So look what he's taking him down on. It's not scientific enough. You're not approaching the ancient world in a way which the heroes of science do, right? And so it really shows you the mindset of people in what you might call like academic classics at the time. I'll give you another example. Come back to that slide. Friedrich August Wolff, another German classicist. He was actually a little bit before Nietzsche. So this is the guy who comes up with the idea that Homer was not one guy. And how does he determine this? Via the science of philology, right? He's using philological techniques to examine the language, the Greek, and conclude that this is not one voice, one mind, one person. This is the result of, as we all know now, a group of bards over time, oral tradition. But there's a way in which he sort of kills Homer, right, by dissecting him in a way. There's a sort of scientific, antiseptic quality to this work. And this is my sort of, I'm imagining Wolff dissecting Homer, sacrificing him on the altar of science at the dawn of the birth of modern classical philology, perhaps a little over the top. But what's interesting is that the publication of this idea, the Prolegomena ad Homerem, as it's called, it was a sort of things to be said about Homer before reading him, It's also one of the first instances that we know of one scholar claiming that another has stole their idea. Wolf's teacher, Heine, I believe, claims that this is a stolen idea, and in fact that Wolf got the idea from him at their seminar. So you see the beginning also of kind of academic disagreements, the importance of tying one's publications to one's ideas for advancement in academia here too. All these things that those of us who have spent time in modern academia know very well. Now, I would like to argue via a passage of Latin from the Prolegomena that maybe things were not quite so clear, and that even Wolf himself perhaps felt somewhat wistful about dichotomizing this approach to scholarship in this way. So let's just translate this, okay? He's talking about textual emendation. Duplex in primis genus est emendationis, quod libris veterum ad moveri et potest et solet, ut avitiis et maculis quas ex longa peregrinatione in barbariem varias plurimasque traxerunt. Liberati proprius ad antiquam et suam formam revocentur. Alterum plus negotii et paene dixerim aerumnae habet. Alterum plus otiosae delectationis. Utrumque recte si adhibetur utile est, at alterum utilius. Okay? So what does this mean? There are principally two types of emendation, and you could say sort of more broadly, scholarship, which is able and is accustomed to be applied to the books of the ancients, thank you, in order that they might
liberated.
In order that they, once liberated from the, thank you, Matthew, from the, maybe I should just call on you, in fact, from the vices and stains which they have taken from their long peregrination, their long travel, through barbaries, which here is really through time, right? In order that they, liberated, might be called back to their, more closely to their antique and own original form, right? Okay, but here's the important sentence. So there's two types of scholarship. One has more habet plus negotii. It's more businesslike, and paede dixerim arumnae, more of a challenge, right? Alterum plus otiosae delectationis. The other's more fun. Now this is the part that really gets me. Utrumque, both of them, recte si adhibetur, if they're used rightly, are useful. At alterum utilius. But one of them is more useful. Which one? Now, in Latin, typically, alter means the second of the two. But occasionally, if you're a good philologist, you know that it could also mean the first of the two. So what I would like to propose here is that Wolf knew that very well. And he is playing here with the false dichotomy presented by, on the one hand, negotium, and on the other hand, otium. And when every once in a while you get one of these moments where you're in literature and it sort of recalls life. And I remembered my conversation with Conte. Bello, ma nostro lavoro è un altro, right? I mean, he's saying the same thing. He said it to me when I was 25-year-old sitting in his office. And so I guess you see where I'm going here, that we are now the inheritors of of this tradition, of this dichotomy, of this antagonism between two different orientations to humanistic inquiry that has been perpetuated into the modern academy and persists. It's why if you go on Facebook, you'll find a Facebook group called Teaching Latin Traditionally, which has 1,100 members, 1,100 members, of people who really don't want to speak Latin, right? because it is otiosus, right? And they are interested in doing rigorous scholarship. And on the other hand, you find groups of strange people gathering to speak Greek and Latin on weekends, and seemingly ne'er the twain meet. I think it's still going on. So that is my argument. Dixie, and thank you all for coming. I'd love to hear your questions if you have any. Yes?
I have a friend who went to Oxford, and she said that at Oxford, her professors spoke Latin, or like they would teach Latin using Latin. So I'm wondering if it's regional or like the U.S. is more against, or like the academia is more against spoken Latin.
When was this?
Very recent.
Yeah, so recently there have been inroads, right, into the sort of traditional academy, you might say, where there are different programs and people teaching. And Princeton taught a class a couple of years ago, and Cornell had a spoken Latin person. So it's starting to break down, and yet, the professors at the New York City universities who are in the room here could tell. Oh wait, there are none. I still think there's a sort of certain hostility, which is not. I mean, it's not mean-spirited. I think it's rooted in history. Is sort of my point. Yes.
This is directed at you, or perhaps someone who also knew him. But I was just wondering if you ever discussed it with, or knew what Reginald Foster thought of this particular debacle.
He didn't really like academia.
Yeah. Well, yeah. There's a sort of hostility.
But not speaking the languages, I meant.
Well, it's complicated, right? On the first level, Reginaldus obviously loved spoken Latin and encouraged everybody to speak Latin. I think he was trying to get. He used to say the Latin language had not come down from heaven in a golden box. Okay, like he wanted people to like build real, authentic, living relationships with the language so that they could feel it, and On the other hand, he was also quite anti this totalizing. Spoken Latin is the silver bullet and will like say, he was a philologist at heart, Reginald, really.
He embodies this thing.
Yeah.
Sorry, what?
He embodies the alter of the utilitas
He
situation.
He really, he used to say, listen, anybody can learn to play chopsticks on the piano, right? So if you want to say, ego hodie comedi paniculum, that's not that hard to learn how to do. If you practice for 6 months, you can do it. Good luck reading Tacitus, if you practice for 6 months. So he had a real respect for rigorous, philological inquiry as well. So that's why I say it's complicated. It's like it's really a false dichotomy, is my point, and I think he got that. Yes.
He embodied that.
Yeah, he was. I mean, his persona was in some ways sort of a sort of, instantiation of that, right?
But there was like joy, but there was also so much like learning and rigor, and there was so much there.
Yeah, John.
So I'm wondering, like, what you think about like similarities and differences between what's happening in the classics world with Latin and Greek in particular, and there are like efforts at like reviving languages, like with Irish, with Hebrew, for example, in Israel. They like, and those two examples seem similar in particular to Latin, because like they're very hotly controversial in like the crowds that care about them.
Right.
But yeah, I guess like whatever way you thought about this.
Well, I haven't thought too much about this in other areas, but I will say those two examples that you brought up, like the thing that occurs to me immediately is that they're both connected to like nationalist projects, right? And in one case, also like a religious project. So I think that changes the dynamic quite a bit. Greek and Latin, although they overlap with religion and to some extent, like Western civilization or whatever, it's not the same as like Hebrew, right? So I think we're still pretty squarely in a sort of academic humanistic context here, and that defines the physics of the situation. Yeah. So, which in some ways, to me, makes it more interesting, right? Because I'm really interested in like what the future of the humanities is for society. I think like, you can look at the sort of spoken Latin movement as a kind of canary in the coal mine for the fate of amateur engagement in the humanities, compared to professional engagement in the humanities. I think about that a lot.
I guess one of the cases in particular, I think it was here that I ran across somebody saying in passing, like, oh, so-and-so, I have no idea who it is, but like so-and-so is raising their kids speaking Latin. And there's like a, if so, that's of like, big anthropological interest, because there's a native speaker of Latin running around in the same way that like the guy who was sort of reviving or creating like modern Hebrew raised his kid. Right. This poor guy raised this kid to be the first Hebrew speaker in centuries. Right.
I would just respond to that, and I'll take some of these other questions. That I've known some of these people who have been raised in Latin and Greek, not Greek so much, but Latin. And I think the difference again is that like things like religion or nations provide sort of structure that allow for a more I think the reason like Hebrew really got off the ground is because you have like big nationalist and religious structures to support that and allow for sort of a real organic thing to blossom in a way that we don't really have and I don't really want us to have, frankly, in classics. So yeah, that's my thoughts on that. Yeah. Okay, lots of questions. So here, and then we'll go to you.
So I guess my question is how to strike that balance, because so if you have, like, I have an administration that's very supportive of, like, do whatever, it's great, but then we have University of California, graduation requirements, and our courses are all AG, University of California, and so Latin 1 is this much, Latin 2 is this much, and on for high school. And it would seem, from what I've heard talking to other teachers, that the spoken Latin, and this probably wasn't your experience with Father Reginald, but for someone where I'm coming from, it can slow down the pace. Yeah. And if you can't do that, like if you get college credit from UC, or high school credit from UC for this much Latin, how do you find that balance? And I wish Father Reginald were still around.
Yeah, me too.
Learned it from him too.
So, yeah, this is a question I get a lot in various contexts. Like, how do you? I think the way Reggie would have taught was a super traditional grammar translation tradition, where you're like AP using the commentaries or whatever, and then just like speaking Latin about the stuff that you learn. So you're reading a sentence of Virgil, and you're sitting there with a normal traditional commentary, and then he would go, Arma virum quae cano, quid diceret Virgilius si hoc esset futuro, so he would just like sort of use Latin as kind of like living, live, engaged commentary with a totally normal curriculum. I think there's like a lot like that really differs dramatically from the sort of active Latin movement that's like, oh, not only is the text going to be all Latin, but the grammar instruction is going to be in Latin too, and you're never going to hear an English word in this classroom. I mean, it's not realistic in a lot of classrooms. I don't think that, again, you don't have to do that to bring living Latin into your classroom. You could do 5 or 10 seconds for each student as you go through. So that's how I think he would have, and I would advocate. Yeah. One more, and then I think we have to stop.
I had a similar question.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd be curious, like, more from like a student's perspective, and this is more like, I guess, a practical question. Like, how do we balance sort of like the necessity of like, as somebody who wants to like enter this world, like having to do the grammar translations and teachers who are sort of unwilling to participate in like the living style? How do we sort of like practically get into it and get like real world experience.
Right. Well, there's this organization called the Paideia Institute, which runs. There's actually a vast pantheon now of like organizations out there doing this, right? And that's what I would sort of recommend is like do your traditional curriculum at your school, and then seek spoken Latin experiences in this kind of other world, alterum utilius, right? Like in this other world, through Paideia, through Salvi, through other organizations, the Ancient Language Institute, other organizations offering these kind of experiences. Yeah. Unfortunately, that does perpetuate the dichotomy in a way, but I think the philology is really important. At the end of the day, we shouldn't throw that baby out with the bathwater by getting excited about speaking Latin.
And I can say too that, I didn't start speaking Latin really with Reggie sort of, but really not till a little bit later. And I think that your access to the text is so much greater when you are using the language actively. So you can learn all the grammar and do all that stuff, but then you start using the language as a language, then you will read more quickly. So it's very useful. But from that perspective.
Okay, we should stop. Keep this conference running. Thank you all for coming.